Apartheid is a crime against humanity. Israel has deprived millions of Palestinians of their liberty and property. It has perpetuated a system of gross racial discrimination and inequality. It has systematically incarcerated and tortured thousands of Palestinians contrary to the rules of international law and waged war against a civilian population, in particular children. And that was said by Nelson Mandela in 2001. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Igan, and I'll be your host for the next hour. It's a pleasure to be back on air again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first show that I've done since returning from my peregrinations. I was going to be talking about my trip and informing you of some of the plans that I've got for next year and discussing some of the things that I've had so many emails and requests to discuss, especially my time in Peru. But I will discuss those things on one of those requests hopefully next week on the show. But I've decided that in light of recent events, this show, my first show upon returning, should take a different and somewhat more serious direction. And folks, I'd like to dedicate this program to the 1.6 million people in the Gaza Strip who have just suffered under a blistering terrorist attack from the terrorist government of the State of Israel. Israel has recently spent 8 days pounding the impoverished people of Gaza with as much military might and death and destruction as it could muster in its latest act of genocide and ethnic cleansing that it so thinly disguises as a war. Bear in mind, of course, though, folks, that when you have a war, it is usually two armies battling it out. But in the case of the Israeli-Gaza conflict, we see on one side the most powerful military nation on earth, and on the other side, in Gaza, we see a civilian population that has no army, no navy, no air force, no military, no ordnance, no artillery, no tanks, no batteries. All it has is light weapons and a few homemade skyrockets which don't explode when they hit the ground. And Israel actually dares to call its brutal assault against these people a war. And folks, I'd like to point out to you that of the 1.6 million people in the Gaza Strip, over 800,000 of these people are children. And of course, of the adults that are left out of that equation, around about 400,000 of them are women. So there is approximately 1.2 million women and children of the 1.6 million people that exist in the Gaza Strip. And as I said, these people have recently spent 8 days being carpet bombed as a response by Israel to the rocket attacks that Hamas sent to Israel, which they did as a response to Israel assassinating the head of Hamas military, Ahmed Jabir, who was, of course, in the middle of the process of drafting a lasting truce and a peace accord with Israel. So the fact that they took this guy out, folks, he's the leader of Hamas military, and he was in the final stages of a peace accord which would have brought about a lasting truce between Palestine and Israel, and it was this man that the Israelis chose to target. So let there be no mistake, folks, that Israel does not want peace. Israel wants war, and it is using the Palestinian people as cannon fodder in order to bring this about. Of course, we saw a recent clip that I actually covered while I was in Gaza, and you can actually see it, folks. If you want, you can find it halfway down the Crow House homepage, or you'll find it on YouTube. Just look for Max Igan and Ken O'Keefe, False Flags and the American Interest. And what we did was we offered you a breakdown of a talk that was given by Patrick Clausen, a Jewish lobbyist for the Institute of Near East Studies, in which he said that if America can't get us to war with Iran, then perhaps it would be best if someone else started the war. And this is what it would appear Israel is attempting to do in Gaza, because this is why they target women and children the way they do, folks, because they wish to provoke a response from countries such as Iran, so then they can scream, oh dear, we're now being attacked and we need to start a global conflict in order to fix the attack that we have provoked ourselves. This is what Israel does, folks. Israel is there to create instability, and that has been its purpose ever since being founded by the Rothschilds in the Balfour Declaration, which was the original plan to steal the Palestinians' land and turn the whole place into Israel. The Balfour Declaration is really a telltale document, folks. It's a piece of paper that was authored by a man called James Balfour and given to Rothschild around about 1917, I think. And this basically outlined a Zionist plan to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And in fact, there was already a Jewish homeland recognized in Palestine. I mean, all the Palestinians recognized that Israel was a particular religious area. It was a part of Palestine, but it wasn't a country. It was simply a Jewish area of Palestine. And of course, in Palestine, we used to have Christians, Jews, and Muslims all living side by side in perfect harmony until the State of Israel was founded, because suddenly this plan came forth to create a Jewish homeland in a place where there actually already was one. And so really when you look at that, it becomes obvious to what the actual plan was to create a Jewish state. And that's what they did. So I don't know, folks. I mean, all these people that say that Palestine never existed and Israel's supposed to be there, I mean, I guess they just don't know modern history. But unfortunately for them, all of these documents actually still exist. And it really does go a lot deeper than that, because the deal was actually further solidified via the transfer agreement, which was a deal between Zionists again and Adolf Hitler in 1933. And that's right, folks, that's 1933. That's well before World War II. And this was because Hitler had already started shutting down all of the Zionist and Jewish businesses in Germany, because Germany was in a state of where the people of Germany were basically being dispossessed of their own country through the Jewish businesses that had taken hold in the country and were sort of milking it dry. And so Hitler had already decided that he wanted to get the Jews out of Germany, and so they signed this deal in order to procure part of Palestine. And you can look that up, folks, the transfer agreement. There's actually a book written called The Transfer Agreement, and it's written by a Jew. I think the author's name is Edwin Black from memory, and he is a Jew, and he had a look into this, and this is what he found, and so he wrote a book. So I suggest you have a look at that, and I'm sure you'll find it very educational. And again, folks, yes, that's 1933. That's before World War II, and before all of the stuff that happened in 1947, which involved England and further solidified the creation of the Israeli state. So the plan to create Israel has been around for a very long time. It wasn't just a result of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was simply what was used to legitimize it and to create the eternal victim status umbrella over the terrorist actions of Israel, so that no one will ever judge Israel for its actions, because poor Israel is the eternal victim. And it is this eternal victim status that has allowed Israel to carry out the atrocities it has been carrying out ever since World War II. All very contrived, my friends. And it even goes deeper than that, because according to some of the people that I spoke to when I was in Palestine, when the whole plan was created to set up Israel, apparently it was a three-part plan. And what this plan required was, number one, establish the Israeli state. Of course, they didn't say that in the Balfour Declaration. They said they simply wanted a Jewish homeland. Part two required the removal of the name Palestine from the maps. And part three required the separation of Gaza from the West Bank. And this is what I was told by some of the elders that I spoke to during my stay in Gaza. And of course, Israel has managed to achieve all three of these objectives, just as it has achieved its objective in this latest conflict. And I say it has achieved its objective because the objective of Israel is to create conflict. And that is its purpose, and that is what it has done very well in this latest escalation of violence. I was actually in communication with my friends in Gaza during the attack, and they spent the entire 8 days in a state of pure terror, folks. Apparently, during the waves of attacks that Israel relentlessly launched against these people, they were bombing quite literally everywhere throughout Gaza. They weren't just targeting military outposts or military establishments or really anything to do with the military. They're mainly targeting residential areas. We had 21 members of one family, 3 generations, taken out with one bomb. And of course, they are doing this in response to Hamas hurling rockets at Israel. But let us not forget, folks, that Hamas rockets are homemade and they don't explode. They're just big tubes of iron that land and put a hole in your roof. They sort of don't blow up when they get there. There was one man saying how terrified he was because he had a hole in the back window of his car from a Hamas rocket. I mean, if you look at these statistics for this latest so-called war, what you see is that there are about 165 or something. I may have that figure wrong, but there was well over 100 Palestinians who were killed, and there were actually 3 Israelis killed during the conflict, and the 3 Israelis actually died of heart attacks. So this is hardly terrorism. And of course, what we saw from Israel as a response to these 3 heart attacks was Israel lobbing 100-pound and 500-pound bombs into residential areas in the Gaza Strip and targeting mainly women and children, as is Israel's way. Of course, it's very difficult not to be targeting women and children when you attack Gaza, folks, because, as I said before, of the 1.6 million people in the Gaza Strip, 1.2 million of these people are women and children. So essentially what Israel is doing is waging a so-called war against a civilian population consisting mainly of women and children. Poor little victimized Israel. As I said, folks, everything that the Israeli government is doing against the people of the Gaza Strip can be classed as nothing but terrorism. It really is not anything else, folks. There's no other definition for this stuff. In fact, I would name Benjamin Netanyahu as the worst terrorist in the world today. He is a global disgrace, and he needs to be arrested at the first opportunity. And perhaps we could take him to The Hague, and he could face the same fate that he has forced upon the many children that he has killed in these unwarranted, unprovoked, and very contrived attacks, which seem to be little more than an election stunt by a true terrorist, if ever there was one. I had actually planned to return to Gaza, folks. As soon as I heard that the place was under attack from Israel, I had planned to return to Gaza. I was there last month in September and October, and I made some truly wonderful friends while I was there, and it was a wonderful opportunity to see the place from the inside and to see what the conditions are actually like, and to get to meet the people and see what the people are actually like. And I have to say that I have never met a warmer or more friendly group of people in my entire life. The people that I met in Palestine I count amongst some of my dearest friends. And there's also been a large amount of conflict happening in the West Bank while this is going on. There has been an unnamed amount of people detained in the West Bank who are protesting against the illegal terrorist attacks being perpetrated against their brothers and sisters in the Gaza Strip. And of course, that's a very terrible thing, folks, because when people are arrested by Israel, what happens is they just disappear into an Israeli jail. Currently, there are over 4,600 people held in 27 different jails and detention centres around Israel. None of these people have been charged with any crime. They are all held without charge. And some of them have been in there for up to 10 years. Many of them have been subject to things such as solitary confinement for up to 2 or 3 years at a time. And this can happen to a Palestinian if you do something as simple as complaining at a checkpoint. And let's really put this into perspective, folks, because, I mean, looking at the West Bank, I don't know how to really compare the landmass to other countries, but in the perspective from my country, the West Bank in Palestine is around about the size of the Sydney western suburbs. And in that area, there is 500 Israeli checkpoints. And they make it very, very difficult for you to cross through any of these checkpoints. Sometimes it can take up to 6 hours to get through a checkpoint. And of course, if you have to make it back through the checkpoint in order to get home that day, well, that's just too bad. And if you're not through, if you're found in an area that is not your own, then we may consider you to be a terrorist and we may shoot you. There are women who actually give birth at the checkpoints, folks, because it takes that long to get through, and the Israeli military will not even allow a woman in labour to take precedence at the checkpoint, and they will allow them to give birth in the dirt on the side of the road rather than let them through. There are streets in the West Bank where Israelis live and Palestinians also live, but the Palestinian houses are not allowed to open onto this street, and no Palestinians are allowed to walk on this street. Folks, that is the definition of apartheid, and so just the fact that that exists, folks, I mean, there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that Israel is an apartheid state and is the biggest threat to global stability that exists anywhere in the world today. And folks, something else that you sort of need to take into account here is that those conditions that I just related to you as the way life is in the West Bank, 500 checkpoints in an area the size of Sydney western suburbs, taking up to 6 hours to get through, and people giving birth on the side of the road. This is the way it used to be in Gaza as well, but the people had an election and voted for change. And I think I recall a recent president being elected to the United States on a platform of change. And so the people voted for Hamas because they wished to see a change from this condition, the condition that I've just described to you in the West Bank, which was the condition of Gaza. And of course, Hamas was also offering things such as better health care, better living conditions, better school conditions, all this sort of stuff that governments promise you. I mean, does it sound familiar, folks? So they did vote for change, thereby electing Hamas, and because they elected a government that was not going to allow the Israeli checkpoints to persist all through the state and was not going to allow the people to be terrorized by Israel the way they are, then Israel named that government as a terrorist government and blockaded the entire Gaza Strip, thereby subjecting every man, woman and child in the Strip to a state of extreme scarcity and a state that you would not put up with for 1 week, folks. And bear in mind, again, that half the population in Gaza is children. So this is what we're facing. And don't get me wrong here, folks. I mean, I don't support Hamas, but be that as it may, life in Gaza under Hamas, even though the place is blockaded, is better than life in the West Bank under a so-called democratic system controlled by Israel, because anywhere that Israel is allowed to control becomes a military dictatorship with extreme hardship put upon the people within that state. And if you wish to debate that point with me, well, all I can say is take a look at the West Bank and I rest my case. But the reality is that it goes deeper than all of that still, because really what you've got to look at, folks, is that the country is called Palestine, and that which calls itself Israel is actually an occupying force. It was a force that was transplanted there by a situation that was brought about by things such as the Balfour Declaration, the Transfer Agreement, the deals that were made after World War II, the massive influx of European Jews to the area. And then once they had the area, even though they had the area that was designated to them by the United Nations, which wasn't even theirs to give, then they proceeded to take over the rest of the place. And what we've got is pockets of Palestinian civilization that is left over that are basically treated as surplus human beings. And these people form the resistance of what once was Palestine, and that's all that's left. And the plan of the Jewish state, the plan of Israel, is to eliminate these people from existence so that the entire land of Palestine becomes Israel. That was the whole Zionist plan all along, and we need to pay attention, because the people in Palestine are not terrorists. They are people who are fighting for survival and recognition against an invading force which uses terrorism against them on a daily basis. And everything Israel has done towards Palestine has been a war crime. But the world just isn't paying attention. This is why so many people are against Israel, folks. And having gone to Gaza and seen the state that these people are kept in, all I have to say is that the Arab world has showed a remarkable and incredible, a phenomenal amount of restraint in its lack of response to the terrorism and pure abuse that these people are subject to on a daily basis by the state of Israel. And bear in mind, folks, that what is in control of Israel is a group of Zionists. I'm not saying anything anti-Semitic here with anything that I'm saying, and if you're construing my conversation as being anti-Semitic or anti-Jew, then I would suggest that you need to go and have your head examined, because I'm not speaking out against Jews and I'm not saying anything anti-Semitic. What I'm doing is I'm making a stand against the Rothschild-sponsored criminals who are in charge of the state of Israel. That's what I'm talking about. It's got nothing to do with the Jews. What it's about is these scumbuckets who are in control, who are abusing and destroying and attacking and humiliating and doing everything they can to destroy the people in Palestine. That's who I'm talking about. And these people are sponsored by the bankers. They're supported by all of our governments because our governments are a bunch of criminals, folks. And you know why our governments are getting away with what they're getting away with? They're getting away with it because we do not understand what our relationship to these people is. Your relationship with your government, wherever you are in the world, is one of trust. You are the grantor of power to the government in your country. The people who hold power in that government are trustees of the power that you give them. They are trustees of the country that you own. You are the beneficiaries of the trust that they hold. If these governments are placing anybody in your country, no matter what country you are in, if they are placing anybody within that country in a state of hardship by allowing people to suffer in order to support a corporate system and an economic model, then these governments are in breach of trust. And it is up to the people to re-establish what their true relationship with government is. Your governments are fiduciary trustees, my friends. You, whichever country you are in, you own the wealth of that country. You, the people of your country, are the owners of your country, if anybody owns the country at all. Personally, I would say that nobody owns the country. I would say that the country owns the people. I mean, how can you really consider that you own anything, folks? You're only here for a little while, and the country will be here for literally millions of years after you are gone. So what on earth makes you think that you actually own anything? You don't. You're just an experience that happens for about 60 to 100 years. And what is important is what you do with that experience. So what is the legacy that you are going to leave behind? Whoever you are out there listening to this radio show, what is the legacy that you're going to leave behind? Are you going to leave the world in a better state because you were in it? Or are you just going to collect stuff while you're out here? Is that what it's all about, just collecting stuff? Is that what the world's about? I really don't think so, folks. I think the world is about far more than that. And I think that what people have to understand about the world is that we are all in this together. This really, truly is one human family. And the only reason our governments get away with what they're doing is because we do not understand who and what we are. We do not understand what our place in the food chain is. We don't understand what our position in the social hierarchy is. Well, let me tell you something, and it's something that I've told you before. It was man that created society, and it was society that created governments, and it was government that created statute law. That's the way it works. Now, something you've got to understand is that which we create cannot control us unless we allow it to control us. We created government. Government does not control us. We control the government. But the problem is that we have forgotten that our relationship with government is in fact a trust agreement. Now, I might seem a little head up at the moment, folks, but I've just returned from a trip around the world and I've seen the state the world is in, and not only that, I've just returned from a trip to the Gaza Strip. And since returning home, I've had to sit here and watch my friends being carpet-bombed by a terrorist state because we, the people of this planet, do not have the nous and the courage and the wherewithal to hold our governments accountable for the breach of trust that they are currently displaying against the people of this planet. You see, every problem that we face on this planet, folks, is due to government corruption. Every single one. All of the pollution, all of the wars, all of the starvation, all of the homelessness, all of the shortage, all of the state of our society is due to government corruption in every single country on this planet. This government corruption exists and persists because we, the people, do not understand what our relationship with these criminals is. And that relationship is one based in trust. And we got to look at this, folks. We've got to really turn things around. We've got to put things back where they should be, because the world's being destroyed and the people in Gaza are being bombed because of the terrorist actions of governments, because we do not hold these governments accountable for their actions, because we do not know who we are. And it's about time we wake up. So that's why I seem a little bit head up at the moment, and that's why I seem perhaps not my normal calm self. But I would ask you to please understand that I've just spent 8 days sitting here in enormous frustration watching the beautiful friends that I made in Gaza being carpet bombed by terrorists while it was being presented to the world as a righteous act of creating peace and a necessary defense by the poor, victimized state of Israel. But what it actually was, folks, was Israel deciding to go and murder women and children because they chose to respond to a terrorist attack from Israel. I'm sick to death of Israel, folks. There is nowhere in the world, there is no room in the world for a Zionist-controlled Israel. And even the people within Palestine that I spoke to, they said, hey, the Jews, they've been there for years. We've got no problem with them. They've been there for ages. We don't have a problem with them being there. They have a right to be there. They have a right to populate this land as much as we do. But what's with the wars? What's with the military? We didn't have a problem with these people until the Western Europeans came over and started to set up this whole Zionist state. And then they began stealing all of our land and putting up all these walls and lobbing bombs everywhere and creating all these false flag attacks and doing everything they could to create global instability. That's what the people in Palestine have got a problem with. And even if they are lobbing rockets over the wall, well, what are they lobbing them into Israel? Or are they lobbing them into the occupied territories that Israel promised to give back to Palestine in an agreement that was signed by Jimmy Carter? I mean, how many years ago was that? Jimmy Carter actually made an agreement with Israel that they would relinquish control of the territories that they currently occupy. So really, when you look at it, Palestine isn't even lobbing rockets over into Israel. It's lobbing rockets into areas that are occupied by an invading force. It's just a pity that the Israelis chose to go and build houses in this area because it's actually a war zone that they don't own, that they agreed to give back in an agreement signed with Jimmy Carter. So I think they really need to reevaluate their position. They really need to take a big, strong look at themselves. And the people of the world really need to wake up. They really need to know what side they are supporting in this. Because what there is good and evil. There are no sides. There's simply what is right and what is wrong. And what Israel is doing is what is wrong. And what the governments are doing that are supporting Israel is what is wrong. And what is needed is for the people of this world to stand up and do what is right. And what is right is to acknowledge what your place in the social hierarchy of this world is. What your place in the food chain is. You are man. You created government. Government is in breach of trust, and we need to bring these people back in line, because if we do not, we are not going to have a world. Don't wait for someone to come and save you. The Saviour is staring at you in the mirror, and it's about time you acted, because as the custodians of this planet, action is what is required. And by action, I'm not saying that you go out and fight the system. There's no good fighting the system, folks. The system is fiction. We made the whole thing up. And when you fight it, all you do is give it power. There's no good fighting it. What you've got to do is disconnect from it. I think that once we can rein this government in and put it back on track over a period of 2 or 3 generations, government will simply phase itself out because of its unnecessary nature. I don't think we need government at all. What we need is self-governance. But we're not going to get that until people are properly educated in reality, until people understand who and what they are. And you're never going to get that from a government-controlled education system. But I think we've been given an opportunity here, folks. We've finally been given an opportunity to wake up to ourselves. And I think the current conflict that is happening in Gaza is the prime opportunity. And I think it's about time we took the matter in hand. Personally, I think it's the last nail in the coffin for the terrorist state of Israel. I think they finally showed their true colours. People now see just how destructive, hateful and malicious the Israeli government is, how much it wishes to create conflict, how much it relishes in the destruction and the death of women and children. It's a government built on lies and founded on terrorism, and we need to really take the matter in hand. But again, folks, it's not going to happen until we do it. And the only way we're going to do it is to discover the power that exists within each of us. But I think it's break time now, folks, so I'll leave it there for now. I'll speak to you again in a few minutes. Thanks for listening. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now, continuing our discussion on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, what I'm going to be doing for you in this last section of the show is I'm going to be reading quotes to you from a book called BDS. It's the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Handbook, a global campaign to end Israeli apartheid. And I'm going to be paraphrasing a lot of the things out of this book and reading passages from it and talking to you myself amongst the passages. And so I just want to clear that up for you now. And the first thing that I want to start with, there was an article by Sonia Karka of Electronic Intifada, dated May 2007, called John Howard's Dubious National Fund Honour. And that article refers to the Jewish National Fund, or JNF. And in that article, Ms. Karka says, the Jewish National Fund is one of the most prominent Zionist colonization enterprises. It illegally expropriated most of the land of 372 Palestinian villages which were ethnically cleansed by Zionist forces in 1948. The owners of this land constitute over 1/2 of the UN-registered Palestinian refugees. In many instances, the JNF actively participated in the physical destruction of the villages, evacuating their inhabitants and planting parks in their place. Today, the JNF controls 2,500 square kilometres of Palestinian land, which it leases to Jews only. Its aim is to acquire and develop land exclusively for the benefit of Jews residing in Israel. For the last decade, it has marketed itself as the premier Zionist environmental organisation, promoting its blueprint Negev as a miracle of the desert. Thousands of indigenous Bedouin Arabs have been subjected to systematic land confiscations, the destruction of their homes, and deprived of access to flowing water. Some 80,000 Bedouins who once owned 90% of the land in the Negev have been living in 45 unrecognised villages in Israel with no access to amenities and basic services denied to them. The JNF is a multinational corporation with offices in about a dozen countries worldwide, where it is generally registered as a charity. It receives millions of dollars from wealthy and ordinary Jews around the world, most of which are tax-exempt contributions. To avoid investigation, honours are bestowed upon non-Jewish notables, such as naming forests after them, and some of Australia's former Prime Ministers are among them. JNF also extends its operations by proxy or directly into the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza, and all this is in clear violation of international law, and particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention, which forbids confiscation of property and settling of the occupier's citizens in occupied territories. Ethnic cleansing, expropriation of property and destruction of homes are war crimes. As well, use of tax-exempt donations in these activities violates the domestic law in many countries where the JNF is domiciled. And that really is a very rational summary of the Jewish National Fund by Sonia Karka, folks. See, the root of the problem is that when Israel was unilaterally created in May 1948, less than 6 months after the UN voted to petition Palestine, what happened was it dispossessed the Palestinian people of their homes, properties and lands, and refused more than 750,000 of them the right to return home. And those Palestinians from that period and their descendants are still either internally displaced or are living in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. They now number around 5 million, I believe. Now, in 1967, Israel occupied the remaining Palestinian lands, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, and to this day has subjected the Palestinians living there to a brutal regime of apartheid and ethnic cleansing as it continues to execute with impunity its colonization program and the Judaization of the Palestinian lands. Now, at the time of Israel's 1967 conquest, one of its most revered intellectuals, a man called Yeshayahu Leibowitz, prophesied that this colonizing situation will turn into a system of imposed rule over two peoples, one ruling and the other ruled. And he then surmised it to be unlikely that human rights and civil freedoms could exist even within the Jewish sector. The consequences, he said, will lead to the self-destruction of the Jewish state and of relations with the Arabs based on perpetual terror. And he warned Israel that there was no way out of this situation except by withdrawal from the territories. And now, more than 4 decades later, in 2012, The warning bells may well be ringing too late for Israel, and it could be seen to be exemplified by the latest conflict in Gaza that Israel is now imploding and that justice is waiting at the gates. Now, I say that Israel's regime over the Palestinian people amounts to apartheid, precisely because it displays many of the main features of the crime as defined by international law. Now, number one, racial discrimination against the indigenous Palestinian people who became citizens of the State of Israel was formalised and institutionalised through the creation by law of a Jewish nationality, which is distinct from Israeli citizenship. No Israeli nationality exists, even in Israel, and the Supreme Court has persistently refused to recognise one, as it would end the system of Jewish supremacy in Israel. In 1950, the law of Jewish return entitled all Jews, and only Jews, to the rights of nationals, namely the right to enter Israel and immediately enjoy full and legal political rights. Now, number two, the 1952 Israeli citizenship law has created a discriminatory two-tier legal system whereby Jews hold nationality and citizenship, while the remaining indigenous Palestinian citizens hold only citizenship. Under Israeli law, the status of Jewish nationality is accompanied with first-class rights and benefits which are not granted to Palestinian citizens. Number three, the Israeli status law of 1952 authorises the World Zionist Organization, Jewish Agency and its subsidiaries, including the Jewish National Fund, to control most of the land in Israel for the exclusive benefit of Jews. And this constitutes an institutionalized form of discrimination because these agencies, by definition, would deny the use of these properties to non-Jewish citizens of the state. And number four, the return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons as required by international law has been prevented by means of force and legislation simply because they are not Jews. Palestinian refugees were denationalized and thus turned into stateless refugees. You see, Israel's occupation has evolved into a system of warehousing, which Israel is attempting to present as a permanent given, a non-issue, a state of status quo, immune to genuine solution. I mean, it's worse than the apartheid era of South Africa. From every point of view, historically, culturally, politically, and economically, the Palestinians have been defined as surplus humanity. Nothing remains to do with these people except warehousing, which the international community appears willing to allow Israel to do. And if Israel can package and export its layered matrix of control, a system of permanent repression that combines Kafkaesque administration law and planning with overtly coercive forms of control over a defined population hemmed in by hostile gated communities, which they call settlements in this case, and also hemmed in by walls and obstacles of various kinds to movements, then as Naomi Klein writes, every country will eventually look like Israel-Palestine. One part looks like Israel and the other part looks like Gaza. In other words, a global Palestine. You see, what you see, folks, is that with this warehousing and surplusing of humanity, Israel is offering a very useful model that can then be applied to surplus populations everywhere. So you can see where they're going with this, folks, and you can see the importance of addressing this, because if we allow this to continue in Palestine, then we are saying, hey, this is a workable method, and what we're going to see is that that method will eventually reach every country on the planet. This is what they do, folks. They try it out somewhere. Oh, look, the people aren't complaining. Okay, this is what we can do. And all you need is a controlled media, and you can convince people within the countries which this warehousing is occurring that it's good to treat these surplus people this way. I mean, just the concept of surplus human beings is a bizarre thing in itself. Now, as far as Palestinians in the West Bank go, what we see here is that Israel has put into place a matrix that has virtually paralyzed the Palestinian population. And this matrix is composed of several overlapping layers. First is the actual physical control. settlements, a massive system of highways and bypass roads, army bases and industrial parks at key locations, closed military areas, nature preserves, control of aquifers and internal checkpoints and control of all border crossings. The second layer of the matrix is bureaucratic and legal. It involves political zoning of lands to freeze natural development, building permits enforced by housing demolitions to confine populations to restricted enclaves, land expropriation, planting restrictions and the destruction of Palestinian crops, restrictions on movement, restrictions on travel and more. I mean, there's so much. The third layer involves the use of violence to maintain control over the matrix. There is massive imprisonment and torture. Currently, as I said earlier, there are more than 4,600 political prisoners in various locations and jails throughout Israel. Use of collaborators to control local population is also favoured, and pressure on families to sell their lands, and the undemocratic and arbitrary and violent rule of the military commander of the West Bank and the civil administration. And of course, the average Israeli has no concept of this matrix, whereas average Palestinians are highly attuned to its presence since they hit up against it quite literally every time they attempt to move or do virtually anything. Now, when we talk about Palestinians in East Jerusalem, what we find is that since 1967, around 2,000 homes in East Jerusalem have been demolished. The number of outstanding demolition orders is estimated to be at around 20,000. The absence of a building permit can lead to an administrative or court decision to demolish a home. And whilst Palestinians represent about 30% of Jerusalem's population, they are currently confined to just 7% of the city's area, a so-called policy which is aimed at preserving the demographics of the city. This policy is put into practice via a series of discriminatory measures, discriminatory urban planning, discrimination in the allocation of public services between East and West Jerusalem, passive or active support for Judaization of East Jerusalem through illegal settlement construction, precarious residency status, and the demolition process. Housing demolitions are just one mechanism within a matrix of control implemented by Israel via military, economic, administrative, and cultural occupation. Discrimination against Palestinians in Jerusalem is aimed at delegitimizing their presence and claims over the city. Israel local and national governments systematically deny Palestinian legitimacy and make lives unsustainable, while concurrently colonizing Palestinian neighborhoods. These processes are, of course, aimed at the quiet transfer of Palestinian residents out of East Jerusalem. Now, getting back to the industrial sites and parks that Israel places in the industrial zones within the occupied territories, 7 such parks have been built in the occupied territories, with several others in various stages of planning and construction. Yet while providing employment to the Palestinian workforce, they threaten the economic viability of the Palestinian state, and they maintain a dependency upon a relationship with Israel. They allow Israeli firms continued access to cheap Palestinian labour while denying the workers access to Israel, a key component in the separation strategy. And just as serious, the lax environmental standards and low costs means that these industrial parks attract Israel's most polluting industries: chemical, aluminiums, plastics, metalworks, batteries. And the placement of these parks also ensures Israel's ability to continue dumping its industrial toxic wastes into the West Bank. And then we get to Gaza. And Gaza truly is an example of a society that has been deliberately reduced to a state of abject destitution. Its once productive population has been transformed into one of aid-dependent paupers. And the situation in Gaza is undeniably one of mass suffering created largely by Israel, but with the active complicity of the international community, especially the US and European Union, and unfortunately also due to the actions of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Gaza's subjugation began long before Israel's so-called war against these impoverished people. The Israeli occupation, now largely forgotten or denied by the international community, has devastated Gaza's economy and its people, especially since 2006. The deepened sanction regime and illegal siege imposed by Israel and the international community, which has been recently intensified, has all but destroyed the local Gazan economy. There is little in Gazan society that possesses legitimacy. Trauma and grief overwhelm the landscape despite expressions of resilience. The feeling of abandonment among the people in Gaza appears complete, understood perhaps by their growing inability to identify with any sense of possibility. The most striking to me was this comment by a Palestinian person who said, "It is no longer the occupation or even the war that consumes us, but the realization of our own irrelevance." Ladies and gentlemen, if Palestinians, and most especially the people in Gaza, are continually denied what we want and demand for ourselves, an ordinary life, dignity, livelihood, safety, and a place where they can raise their children, and are forced yet again to face the destruction of their families, then what looms is no less than the loss of an entire generation of Palestinians. And if this happens, and perhaps it already has, then the people of the world will most certainly bear the cost. And I, for one, feel a massive solidarity with the people of Palestine, and most especially with the people of Gaza. And look, it just goes on and on, folks. I mean, I could sit here and I could talk to you and read to you all day about the situation in Palestine, the situation in Gaza, and it just goes on and on. It's virtually endless. The apartheid regime that we see in place in Israel and the living conditions that has been imposed upon the Palestinian people, their denationalization, the way these people are simply viewed as surplus humanity to be forgotten about and swept under the carpet, is absolutely disgusting. And it continues because of the lack of response from the international community. And that's why a two-state solution can never work, folks, because the land is called Palestine. It's not called Israel. There is no Israel. Israel is an area of land within Palestine. There is no state of Israel. The State of Israel is a Zionist construct. It was planned well before World War II. It was created through deals that were made with Adolf Hitler. Everything that we've been told about the foundation and construction of Israel has been a lie. Everything that has been brought to the world to establish Israel's legitimacy is a lie. Israel is an illegitimate state, and it is the main source of global instability that exists in the world today. I don't have a problem with Jews, but I have a problem with apartheid. I have a problem with racism. I have a problem with land theft. I have a problem with the dispossession of people. I believe people should be treated equally. I don't believe we need any borders anywhere. I think that Americans who are worried about the Mexicans coming into their country are idiots. I think that people who are worried about anybody crossing the borders into their country are fools. I don't think the borders exist. I think borders are a political construct. And I think once we can get away from borders and start viewing this planet as being one human species, one species of mankind, and we can all get along together, then we're going to start finding solutions to our problems. Now, you can call me anything you want because I don't agree with nationalism. I don't really care. But what I do agree with is the power of the people. What I agree with is human freedom. And I think that we are a species in decline, and we will continue to decline if we don't pay attention. I think the world is waking up to this fact now. I think people are actually seeing the human decline that is occurring, and people are seeing the need to pay attention and start addressing the problem. And so I place great hope in the next 6 months and the next year of life on this planet. I think that this is the tipping point, folks. I think that we've finally reached it. That's what I think the December 2012 date is about. I think it's the time when mankind makes a conscious decision to bring about some positive change. And I know that that's what I'm going to be working for very hard over the next 12 months. I have a very big venture I have planned for next year, my friends. It's going to need a lot of support from people, so I'm hoping that I'm going to get it. But it's also something that a lot of people are going to be able to participate in. There's going to be a lot of online participation that we're going to make available for people, and I'm really hoping to put together a mission and a journey that is going to unite the many people of the world and give us the tools we need to take this consciousness forward. And I'm really hoping to do this. It's a huge venture, and it's kind of still being formulated in my mind, but it will be happening in the new year. The name of the project is Full Circle, so keep a lookout for that, folks. There'll be a website, fullcirclenow.com. If you go there now, you won't find anything there, but there will be a website constructed within the next 2 months that should be up and running by then, and I hope to have the project off the ground and launched and things to be on the road by mid-February 2013. And it's a big effort and it's a big adventure, and like I said, folks, once I've got something a little bit more concrete that I can tell you about, I will give you the plan. But I think this is the year of change, folks, and all it requires is participation, and that's what I'm attempting to organise. Thank you to all the people that have remained loyal to the website and that have supported me during my peregrinations. I know I haven't been on air as much as I wanted to be and as much as you may have liked me to be, but it has been very difficult to maintain things. It's actually totally exhausted any finances I had, so if anybody does feel like making a contribution to the website, that would be great, because I really am going to require some contributions to get this mission off the ground next year, and they are certainly few and far between since I've been off the air. But thank you to all those who have contributed to the website during my absence. It has been a huge benefit, and it's really the only thing that got me home, so I thank you very much for that. Now, I know this probably wasn't the type of radio show that people were expecting from me as the first show upon my return, but there were things that I said today that I just felt that I had to say. I really believe the issue of Palestine and the issue of Gaza to be extremely important, and it's one that very much needs the focus of global attention. And because of the friends that I met while I was there, I feel that I owe it to these people to do this show and to say the things that I said today. I do intend to go back to Gaza next year. I am very much looking forward to it, folks. In fact, if I can find a way to do it, there's a very good chance I may even move to Gaza and be living in Gaza by the end of next year. I really do feel that strongly about the situation over there, and I really do feel that much of a connection to the people. They are quite literally some of the most beautiful people I've ever met in any of my travels and ever met anywhere in my life. And I may be an Australian, but what I can say that in my heart and in my soul, I am Palestinian. And that's about all I really have to say today, folks. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I'll look forward to speaking to you again next week, where I will discuss my trip and I will address some of the many letters that have been written to me. I'll look forward to talking to you then. Please take care until that time. In Lakesh. So I'd like to dedicate this program to the 1.6 million people in the Gaza Strip who have just suffered under a blistering terrorist attack from the terrorist government of the State of Israel. Israel has recently spent 8 days pounding the impoverished people of Gaza with as much military might and death and destruction as it could muster in its latest act of genocide and ethnic cleansing that it so thinly disguises as a war. Bear in mind, of course, though, folks, that when you have a war, it is usually two armies battling it out. But in the case of the Israeli-Gaza conflict, we see on one side the most powerful military nation on earth, and on the other side, in Gaza, we see a civilian population that has no army, no navy, no air force, no military, no ordnance, no artillery, no tanks, no batteries. All it has is light weapons and a few homemade skyrockets which don't explode when they hit the ground. And Israel actually dares to call its brutal assault against these people a war. And folks, I'd like to point out to you that Of the 1.6 million people in the Gaza Strip, over 800,000 of these people are children. And of course, of the adults that are left out of that equation, around about 400,000 of them are women. So there is approximately 1.2 million women and children of the 1.6 million people that exist in the Gaza Strip. And as I said, these people have recently spent 8 days being carpet bombed as a response by Israel to the rocket attacks that Hamas sent to Israel, which they did as a response to Israel assassinating the head of Hamas military, Ahmed Jabir, who was, of course, in the middle of the process of drafting a lasting truce and a peace accord with Israel. So the fact that they took this guy out, folks, he's the leader of Hamas military, and he was in the final stages of a peace accord which would have brought about a lasting truce between Palestine and Israel, and it was this man that the Israelis chose to target. So let there be no mistake, folks, that Israel does not want peace. Israel wants war, and it is using the Palestinian people as cannon fodder in order to bring this about. Of course, we saw Apartheid is a crime against humanity. Israel has deprived millions of Palestinians of their liberty and property. It has perpetuated a system of gross racial discrimination and inequality. It has systematically incarcerated and tortured thousands of Palestinians contrary to the rules of international law and waged war against a civilian population, in particular children. And that was said by Nelson Mandela in 2001. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maxwell Igan, and I'll be your host for the next hour. It's a pleasure to be back on air again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first show that I've done since returning from my peregrinations. I was going to be talking about my trip and informing you of some of the plans that I've got for next year and discussing some of the things that I've had so many emails and requests to discuss, especially my time in Peru. But I will discuss those things on one of those requests hopefully next week on the show. But I've decided that in light of recent events, this show, my first show upon returning, should take a different and somewhat more serious direction. And folks, to Rothschild around about 1917, I think, and this basically outlined a Zionist plan to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And in fact, there was already a Jewish homeland recognized in Palestine. I mean, all the Palestinians recognized that Israel was a particular religious area. It was a part of Palestine, but it wasn't a country. It was simply a Jewish area of Palestine. And of course, in Palestine, we used to have Christians, Jews, and Muslims all living side by side in perfect harmony until the State of Israel was founded, because suddenly this plan came forth to create a Jewish homeland in a place where there actually already was one. And so really when you look at that, it becomes obvious that what the actual plan was to create a Jewish state. And that's what they did. So I don't know, folks. I mean, all these people that say that Palestine never existed and Israel's supposed to be there, I mean, I guess they just don't know modern history. But unfortunately for them, all of these documents actually still exist. And it really does go a lot deeper than that, because the deal was actually further solidified via the transfer agreement, which was a deal between Zionists again and Adolf Hitler in 1933. And that's right, folks. It's a clip that I actually covered while I was in Gaza. And you can actually see it, folks. If you want, you can find it halfway down the Crow House homepage, or you'll find it on YouTube. Just look for Max Igan and Ken O'Keefe, False Flags and the American Interest. And what we did was we offered you a breakdown of a talk that was given by Patrick Clausen, a Jewish lobbyist for the Institute of Near East Studies, in which he said that if America can't get us to war with Iran, then perhaps it would be best if someone else started the war. And this is what it would appear Israel is attempting to do in Gaza, because this is why they target women and children the way they do, folks, because they wish to provoke a response from countries such as Iran, so then they can scream, oh dear, we're now being attacked and we need to start a global conflict in order to fix the attack that we have provoked ourselves. This is what Israel does, folks. Israel is there to create instability, and that has been its purpose ever since being founded by the Rothschilds in the Balfour Declaration, which was the original plan to steal the Palestinians' land and turn the whole place into Israel. The Balfour Declaration is really a telltale document, folks. It's a piece of paper that was authored by a man called James Balfour and given